Okay, so I'm going to be gluing up the 7-2 blank, and it's a very easy process to do. It should only take a couple minutes, and there's really only two things you need. Well, there's really only one thing you need. Some sort of tape. Duct tape's pretty good. Painter's tape or masking tape can work as well, but I've found duct tape to be the strongest holding and the easiest to use for this process. And each blank will come with a baggie of microfibers, and so we're going to use this to thicken up the epoxy to glue the board together. This is way more than what's needed. Yeah, so these are the only two things you need to do to glue together the blanks. All right, so you can tell this is obviously a 3-piece blank, and the best place to do this is just up against a wall of some sort that just kind of stabilizes the board, gives it something to lean against. We're really going to stand it up straight up and down as much as possible, but yeah, so just up a wall is fine, and it's just best to start with, you know, working from the back, the tail of the board up to the nose. So for this board, we only have to do 2 joints, and there's really only one trick to this technique which will allow you to shape without any issues, and that is the process of gluing the blank, and we're going to get into that right now. All right, so we're obviously going to be taking this section and stacking it and gluing it onto this section. It's pretty easy to tell. I mean, these pieces should line up pretty much perfectly. You know, you can practice, get a feel for that. And this is why I like leaning things up against the wall. But before we actually get to applying the epoxy, it just is a bit easier to get the tape going and set the piece aside so that it's easier to do it once we get the epoxy ready. Okay, so as discussed, really all you should need is 1 piece of duct tape on each side of the joint to hold the blank together. That should be more than what's needed. So I have a piece of duct tape here. It might be around 7 to 8 inches. And just to make it easier is I'm going to prep this piece first. And so I'm going to go about half of the tape and press it into this side of the blank. And I have this section of the blank up on a stand here because that just allows the tape to kind of hang freely, and it'll make it a bit easier when we go to stack it and tape it to the tail section. So I'm going to put another piece of tape on the other side, and I'm going to set this just off to the side while we lay up the glue. Okay, so I have about 45 grams of epoxy in the cup, and now I'm just going to add some of these microfibers. And really all we're looking to do is thicken this up to the point where it's not going to be very runny. We kind of want it to stick where we put it. We don't want it as thick as peanut butter, but really the best I could describe it is maybe like a mayonnaise consistency. I know that sounds kind of gross, but that's what we're shooting for here. So this, I would say, is close. I'm going to make it just a bit thicker. And don't stress this out too much. I mean, just get it somewhat close so that it doesn't flow everywhere. And as always, when adding any sort of filler to epoxy, just add it slowly. You can always add more once you can't take it out. So this is a good thickness, I think. It's not as thick as peanut butter. It still kind of flows off the stick. And so that's what we're looking for here. All right, so the secret to this technique is not using a lot of epoxy in the joint. We really do not even want epoxy to make its way towards any of the edges where we're going to shape, because once that epoxy gets in there, it creates an epoxy seam line, and then it's hard to shape it evenly. It's not impossible, but you will feel it as you shape. Looking at this board, I know that the rails are going to be something around here. So I'm going to avoid getting any epoxy in these areas. And I'm also just going to keep it probably a ½ inch from the sides. So you can see I kind of have these zones marked out. So really all I want is the glue in this zone. And so we got to keep in mind, we're going to have some squeeze out. So really what we should be aiming for is just a line of thickened epoxy just in the center of the board there. And so we can expect it to squeeze out just a little bit, hopefully right up right up to these lines that we drew out. And yeah, once you have that, you'll be able to shape it completely fine. So that's the idea here. Just keep in mind, less is definitely more, and less squeeze out, avoid the edges, and that'll make the shaping really easy, really straightforward. All right, so as we discussed, I'm just going to take some epoxy and lay it down in that center zone. And so you can see I'm kind of leaving it in there pretty thick, and that's because I know that it's going to squeeze out. Okay, so hopefully you can see what we have going on there. I have it well within those lines that we kind of sketched out earlier. I guess you could say it's on there somewhat thick. You can kind of see some of the ridges there. And so that's pretty much what we're looking for. And now, since we already prepped that next piece, I'm just going to come down on top of it. Make sure that the tape is out of the way. And once it's on there, you can slide it around just a bit, just to make sure that you have everything squared up and lined up. And then so once we have everything lined up, again, kind of using this wall to lean the board up against, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these loose ends of this tape that we already pre-prepared and make sure that it's only stuck to the top surface, right? That top piece. And I'm just going to gently pull down and then stick it to that next piece. So we have a little bit of tension, and so that tape is pretty much clamping this top section down to the tail end. And you still have some wiggle room once you get it taped down. If it moved a little bit during that process, you can still slide the section just to make sure everything's lined up perfectly. And so that's the idea. So that's the first section. We still have to do the top section, and then that's it. We're just gonna leave the board up against the wall like this to cure up. It'll take about 3 hours, and then it's ready to start shaping. So if you do feel the tape on, just one piece of tape on each side wasn't enough, you can obviously do more. And so my glue line is here. You probably can't see it on camera, but pretty much still the same process. What I'm going to do is just put that piece of tape on there, and then first press it down to one side of the joint, and then pull it tight, and then press it down into the other side. So that tension just acts as a light clamping force and really holds the thing together. Okay, so you can see I just put a piece of tape here for that demonstration if you want more bracing, but we have the 2 on each side, and that's mostly enough. And so you can tell once you have this taped up, it's like pretty much solid. You can easily move the board around, but ideally what we're going to do is just place it standing as straight up as we can, and we're just going to let it cure just like that. All right, so a little demonstration. This was a fish that I had shaped up, and I actually didn't realize it was an inch narrower than I wanted it to be until after it was already done. And frankly, I didn't really like how it came out, especially towards the tail end. So it's just been sitting here collecting a lot of dust, and so I have it up on some blocks. And basically what I'm going to do is take this sandbag and just chuck it in the center. It'll be a demonstration as far as the strength of the joint. So essentially that epoxy, it gets in there with the foam and then cures. So the joint is actually stronger than the surrounding foam. So we'll take a look at it where it breaks, and yeah, we'll be able to just examine that. Okay, so that pretty much just went as expected, and it did snap as I did expect it to snap. So by taking away the sandbag, I really just threw that 50 pounds right on the joint. And you can see that the joint itself held up. You can see where that joint line is right here, going all the way around. And so pretty much it broke around the joint, which is generally what tends to happen, is because the joint, like I said, is itself stronger than the surrounding foam. It's a concept. It's very similar with like wood glue and wood. The joint ends up being stronger than the actual wood. And it's the same thing here with the epoxy and the foam. So you can see that on just both sides, the joint held up nice and strong as it's supposed to, and the foam just snapped as any other foam would snap. So here we are, we have the whole blank here, just leaning up against the wall and curing. So again, in about 3 hours, this thing will be pretty much cured enough to get onto your rack and start shaping.